has been designated a most important day. Who can tell me what is the most important thing about today? Bingo. I was afraid somebody would go into the secular, but today has been appointed the Lord's Day. It's the day that we gather and worship our God, our Father. But in the secular sense, it's also been designated as Father's Day. One of the few things that Richard Nixon did correctly was to approve today as being Father's Day, recognized as Father's Day. Yesterday was a most important day because we had Vacation Bible School. Good attendance. I believe everybody had fun that was here and learned some stuff. And Friday was also a most important day. Who can tell me what this past Friday, June the 14th, why was that important? Flag Day. I'm sorry? Pansy's birthday. Well, I guess, is that more important than flag? Well, okay. Around your, who can tell me when and how it became recognized as Flag Day? Way back in history. I'll give you a hint. Second Continental Congress had something to do with it. The Second Continental Congress recognized it June 14th, 1777, before we even started operating under the Constitution. So just a bit of trivia and history there. Now, we need to remember all of those that are sick, those that are, Brother Clonch has had some few rough days. This past Thursday, he had worn a heart monitor for 24 hours, so you'll have to find out what the results of that is. And there's been a lot of people traveling and still traveling. We need to keep those travelers in our thoughts and prayers, and all those on the sick list. And sure is great. Sister Moore was back this past week, but seeing her back again, it's great. She's feeling better. Anyone else on the sick, injured, or walking wounded list? Yes, ma'am. And that's where? The Memphis one? Okay. That hasn't made the news much, but in Memphis, Tennessee, there's been some major issues going on. And the last count I had, there was over 2 dozen officers that had been injured in one form or another with brick throwing, and a lot of police cars damaged, and things going on. So let's do keep those folks in our thoughts and prayers. If you haven't seen it at all, uh, as with everything else, I'll tell you what I know, which is not all inclusive, because a lot of things we don't know everything that went on. But the gist of it was that the marshals had gone into an area of Memphis called Fraser, which is lower and lower middle class section, to arrest somebody with outstanding warrants. And it wound up that in the process, according to the news, he started to flee in a car and hit some patrol cars and got out with a weapon, and they wound up killing him. And from there, everything just, and the what's and the why's and the how's, let's not get into that because they're investigating and we don't know all the underlying or all the ripples that are taking effect. But let's do keep all of those people in our thoughts and prayers. Brother Clunch. Okay, Raymond Boyd, waiting on results of scans for brain cancer in his 30s, wife, kids, one on the way. And looky who just rolled in. It's always nice to make a late appearance, right? Great to have you here today. Is there anything else we need to? Brother Moore, since you're here this morning, would you mind leading us in a prayer before we begin our Bible study? Yeah. His prayer reminded me of two things. One, he mentioned access to the tree of life. And since we are in the book of Revelation, studying that book, uh, that's where we find the tree of life, where we can get back to it. And the second thing that he mentioned, he probably hasn't a clue that the importance of what he just said. But Vacation Bible School yesterday, he said the seed had been planted. For those of you that are not aware, there was two young ladies here yesterday who are Seventh-day Adventist, but they missed going to their own assembly on a Saturday to attend Vacation Bible School. That is a seed planted. So thank you for that prayer, brother. Revelation, book of Revelation, we are down to starting with chapter 11. But before that, I had mentioned also yesterday, as was just sitting in conversation, a lot of people really get confused over the book of Revelation, whereas I really enjoy the book. It's a lot of fun. If you want just a real quick overview of the book so you don't get confused, if you would just look at, read, and study chapter 1, 2, and 3, and that is John sending the letters to the seven churches, telling those that did right what they was doing right and to continue, and those that are doing wrong what to correct. And he also ended each letter with the phrase of listen and hear, or if you got ears, hear. And if you stay on course and overcome, you'll be given a reward. And then if you skip down to chapters 21 and 22, chapter 21 starting at verse 6, really, and then going on chapter 21 and 22, that tells us of the reward. That tells us of the heaven and those that are in the book of life that get access to that tree of life. So the rest of the book of Revelation is the visions and the battle that's going on in between uh, that take place. And to me, that's what's the fun part. Questions, comments, though, before we then start at chapter 11. Okay. In the first verse of chapter 11, it says, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein." Now, I have told you before, and Brother Clonchus mentioned it, that he and I are on a little bit different wavelength as to what this book applies to in this particular area. Personally, I believe it has to do with Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and then transitions into later. And Brother Clonchus on the wavelength of it is applying to Rome. So, but if we just look at this first phrase here, who are them that worship therein? And if we go back to Acts chapter 26 and look at verse 7, it says, "And to which promise our 12 tribes, instantly serving God day and night, hope to come, for which hope's God's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews." So this would appear, if you tie those together, that they're talking about the temple in Jerusalem, and we'll get down to a few other things that I believe tie that together in a minute. But it's talking about the temple in place there, and the measuring rod. We see that also later in the book about the new temple. And in verse 2 it says, "But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months." Again, I lean toward this being Jerusalem for several facts. One, the courtyard, the temple in Jerusalem was set up where there was the inner court for the Jews and the outer court. Well, actually, it was set up in several stages. They had a location for women, they had a location for the proselytes, and then there was the without courtyard. But one of the big things here is tread underfoot 42 months. Now, I'd mentioned this in a class before about how the destruction of Jerusalem came about, how that uh, Vespasian became emperor and Titus took over, and the siege had happened before Nero died or started, and then it ended when Vespasian gave Titus the go ahead and to destroy it. Well, if you look back in history, the siege actually began February of 67 AD. It ended August of 70 AD. Count your months, 42 months. Does that mean anything? I don't know, but it's fun to look at that way, isn't it? Then when we get down to, "And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." Okay, another number, another confusion. If we average out months to be 30-day months, which we normally do in today's society, if we asked you how long a month is, you'll generally say 30 days, unless you're talking about a specific month, right? So if you average it out to 30 days, if you divide 30 into 1,203 score, which is 60, what number do you come up with? Huh? Same number, 42 months, 3.5 years. So, Brother Clance. Right. The weeks in the book of Daniel. If we had another year or two to study this book, we could have laid down the book of Daniel, 24th chapter of Matthew, and this book, and there's a lot of connection based on those three. But here it's when you look at 1,260 and 42, we're talking about the same time frame. And they're clothed in sackcloth. What is the tradition all the way back into the Old Testament? We even get into Job. What's the significance of wearing sackcloth? Sackcloth and ashes. Periods of weeping and mourning. Exactly. Did you have your hand going up, brother? No. Then when we get to verse 4, these are the two olive trees and the two candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. The significance of this, and it's mentioned a couple of times, and it applies to both Old and New Testament. How was someone condemned for what we would call a felony today, for a death penalty case? Was it by one witness? It was by two witnesses or more. Bring two witnesses or more. Even at the trial of Christ, they needed two witnesses, right? So if we look at Hebrews 10 and verse 28, Hebrews 10 and verse 28. He that despised Moses' law died without mercy under two or three witnesses. So that's my connection there. That's the tie together. Then in verse 5 and 6, they go together. If any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. These have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will. Since we're talking about if this been a figurative language in this book, there are places where heaven means heaven, but heaven means something else. Heaven is generally thought to mean a place of power. If we are talking about the setup in Jerusalem, and I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit because we'll get into this in later verses, but where was the seat of power in Judah during this period of time? Was Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the center of, or the capital of Judea. Now, here's where I'm jumping ahead a little bit when we get to it a little bit later when it starts talking about tenth parts. The Roman Empire in the first century was set up in 10 provinces. Judah was one of the 10 provinces. Jerusalem represented Judah because it was the capital. So later on, when we get down and start talking about some things, because remember, I've said that I believe part of this deals with Jerusalem and part of it transitions to later. When it starts talking about the destruction of a tenth, if Jerusalem, which represents Judah, is wiped out, then that is a tenth of the Roman Empire that's been wiped out. So bear with me as we try to get to that point. But anytime you have a question or comment, jump in. They're going to smite with all those plagues. And so if heaven is being referred to as Judah or Jerusalem, and they are surrounded for 3.5 years waiting on the final siege to be over, you can imagine all the bad things that were happening, the hunger, because it is even documented that through Josephus and a few others, that women were eating their own kids and things of that nature in the sieges. So it got kind of bad. Verse 7 then starts, and when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them and kill them, and their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city. What great city would we be talking about? Jerusalem, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. You see, again, if you go into some of the history of all that had been taking place there, Jerusalem had become like Sodom and Gomorrah or Egypt, all the wickedness that was taking place there. And to cap it off, the last part of that verse says, where also our Lord was crucified. Where was, first off, who is our Lord? Jesus. Where was he crucified? Jerusalem. So that's, to me at least, why all of this ties into at least starting in Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then switching gears and going forward as we get into later chapters. Because as we get through chapter 11, at the close of chapter 11, we are actually closing out the first sequence of all the things that were taking place. And then chapter 12 starts with the new sequence that's taking place, and we'll go through chapter 21 and verse 5. And then verse 21 in chapter 6 starts the conclusion, if we want to look at it, what heaven's going to be like and who all's going to be there. So, questions or comments then down through verse 8. Well, have I got you so confused you don't know what question to ask, or are we pretty much all on the same page? Normal? Because my intent is not to confuse. We are all studying together to learn here. So, verse 9 then says, and they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. This goes all the way, let me read all the way through verse 11 for the thought here. And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwell on the earth. And after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. Again, 3.5 days, the 3.5 years, all of these are significant. But if you imagine that we're still talking about the siege of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, have any of you been in a war zone, a literal war zone, military war zone? Have you read or studied about it? How that when they go in to capture a place, are they worried about the bodies that they're stepping over? Or are people worried about, is a family member worried about going out in the middle of the town that's still being bombed or shot up and to retrieve that body and bury it? They're seeking safety. So you can imagine that all of this is going on during that time frame. Also, the 3.5 days, how long was Christ in the grave? 3 days, technically, but that's only by Jewish count. How many days was he in the grave according to our count? Mm-hmm. But you see, the Jews, the way the Jews counted, they started with the day the event started. If I say, this is Sunday, if I say meet me in 3 days at a certain place in Montgomery, what day of the week are you going to be there? If you're a Jew, it's going to be Tuesday. See, the Jews counted Friday as one, Saturday as one, and the day the event ended as one, and that was Sunday. So that's where they get their 3. And then you can get into part days. So, but you find all kind of numbers used too. But the significance is that the war was going to come to a close, and all of this, and once the battle has taken place, their enemies are going to fear them. Verse 13 says, in the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. Uh, if you have not studied the destruction of Jerusalem much, which actually took place, was that when the city was destroyed, the temple was burned. It was totally flattened. All the building stones were separated because they had uh, adorned it with gold leaf, gold plate, etc. And those invading uh, burned the city to melt it down to get the gold out of it. And when Titus was standing there, he said they could have actually held out a little bit longer, but it was short. If you go back into Matthew, if the days had not been shortened, so Titus says the war could have lasted longer, but they gave up quicker, which means it was shortened, or else more people would have died. Again, that's just one of my connections there. Then verse 14 says, the second woe is past, and the third cometh quickly. Remember when back in the earlier books, the angel that said, woe, 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 and then one had passed, two had now passed, and now the rest of this chapter deals with that third woe. And then that closes out that first sequence. Questions or comments then down through verse 14? Verse 15 says, and the seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. True statements. Christ is back with God. They're reigning forever and ever. 16 through the end of the chapter, we'll read all of that because it is one complete thought that basically deals with the song of triumph. In other words, the battle is over, and now the triumphant song takes place. 16 through 19. And the 24 elders which sit before God on their seats fell upon their faces and worshiped God, saying, we give thee thanks, O Lord God Almighty, which art and wast and art to come, because thou hast taken to thee thy great power and hast reigned, and the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead, and they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants and prophets and to the saints, and them that fear thy name shall small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testimony, or testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thundering and earthquake and great hail. So that is the song, the triumphant song over the battle that's taken place. Now, when we get down to verse 11, remember I'd said that heaven was talking about Jerusalem being the power on earth. Now, if we get down to verse 9, when we start looking and see the temple of God was open in heaven, there is a transition. The reason there's a transition, and it's talking about the new temple, is look at the very next phrase. And there was seen in his temple the ark of his testimony. The ark of the testimony had been long lost before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, had it not? So when we're talking about the temple now and looking at the temple of God and the heaven opened up and seeing where the temple is now, this is going to be that new location, that new temple, because the ark of his testimony is there. Lightnings, meaning the light, the voices, the thunderings, the earthquake, and the great hail. All of that takes place. So, as I've said, through verse 11, then, or chapter 11, that ends that first sequence of the three woes, the events that take place. And then we'll pick up chapter 12, starts the second series, or second sequence. Questions or comments on anything through chapter from chapter 1 on through chapter 11 then. Brother Day can't get anybody talking this morning. All right, starting with chapter 12 then. There appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with sun, moon under her feet, upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. What in the world does that mean? What would this woman represent? Remember, we're in a figurative book here. Galatians 4:4, Jesus was born under the law, which meant what? He was born of woman, right? What is the church often referred to as? The bride. Who is the bride? Well, I really can't ask that question today, can I? But up until a year or two ago, a bride was a woman, wasn't it? Facts are facts, man. Okay. But under this, the churches often represent, women often represent that and the child here that's being born, etc. And we are called what? Children of God. Where do we come from? Everybody. Where do we all come from? We come from woman, which, so it's representing. And when it says that she was clothed with the sun, a lot of people miss the importance of that statement. But last Sunday or Sunday, Wednesday, or whatever day it was that I was teaching before, what is the physical sun in our galaxy to the rest of this galaxy? Everything. Would this galaxy, would this earth exist without that sun being exactly where it is and doing exactly what it does? So, and sun also represents light. So here this woman is clothed, meaning that she has the power and the light. She even has that crown of 12 stars, which represents the power. Travailing in birth, wanting to be delivered, Christ, who's going to go on. Questions, comments? Yes, sir, Brother Jeremy. It's representative of the church. Verse 3, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head. Now there is a distinct difference between the crowns and everything going on between between the woman, because she has a crown of 12 stars, meaning positive. Here, who is the great red dragon? That would be Satan. He had 7 heads. He had 10 horns, had 7 crowns upon those. Didn't mention anything about stars. He has power, but Satan's power is limited by whom? God sets the parameters that Satan can operate in. If we go back to the book of Job, chapter 1, the discussion that takes place between God and Satan at that point, what takes place? Satan first says, you have a hedge around him. Well, you can do anything you want to except. What would that except mean? Limiting his power. He's giving him access, but he's limiting the access. If Satan were not limited by God today, would any of us be able to shun the devil. But what does the Bible tell us? What does it say Satan will do if he will flee? If we resist, he will flee. How can we resist if we have not been given the power to resist? And why will he flee if he has not been limited as to his authority or his power? So, but then his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now, the reason I said that the woman represented the church, we can go all the way back into the book of Exodus. What happened in the book of Exodus around the time of Moses? What did Pharaoh want to do with all the children, male children, was to kill them before Moses was born. What did Herod want to do in just before Christ was born? He wanted to eliminate that. So when Satan here is standing before, Satan is the opponent of Christians. Satan is the opponent of God. So he is here, and if you can stop something before it starts, it's easier than if you try to stop it after it starts. So here Satan, both in the Old Testament, was trying to stop it before it started. In the New Testament, he's trying to stop it before it gets a start. Brother Clunch? So you take the woman to be back and represent the Jewish tradition? Okay. Okay. I go along with that. Okay. Anyone else? All good points. Verse 5, and she brought forth a man child who was to rule over nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. So this does represent her giving, the woman giving birth to Christ, who's going to be caught up to God on his throne. But what does it mean, rule by a rod of iron? Does Christ rule with a rod of iron? I think so. I believe so. He is not a cruel boss or a cruel person, but what has he done? He has set out what we have in a collection of letters right now and all, a book. And what does this book do? It is the guidelines or the operating directive or whatever you want to phrase it, the regulation, law, whatever you want to say. And where the rod of iron comes in is if a person is obedient, you're here. If you're not obedient, you're here. It's all right down the line. There is no wavering or vacillating or changing minds. It's there, Brother Jeremy. And that sword is mentioned also as being in Hebrews as being what? Sharper than any two-edged sword to rend asunder, even to the marrow. So if you're cutting down to the marrow, if you've got an instrument that's sharp, what are you doing? Let's bring it into some of these hunters. Anybody in here hunt? Anybody carry a skinning knife? Any of you do field dressing? What are you doing? You're separating the what? Good from the bad, what you want to leave behind. If you're field dressing a deer, for instance, what do you leave behind? The stuff that's not good, the stuff you don't want. So if you've got a knife that's that sharp, a sword that's sharp, you're cutting right down to the bone, or as we say, to the quick, and dividing good and bad. And that's, to me at least, where that rod of iron is. Brother Jeremy, yes, sir. And in that verse that you're in that quote, doesn't it isn't son spelled S-U-N instead of S-O-N? Not sure about. Well, anyway, uh, right. Oh, that's an excellent point. Brother Clarence just made that this rod of iron is is not dealing with those that are good. The rod of iron is dealing with their oppressors. Today, if we really look at law, what does the law do? Does the law punish good law-abiding citizens? Not supposed to. We sometimes get caught up in something that's where things don't go exactly right, but the law is meant to regulate and punish the offenders, those outside the law. But in verse 6, it says, he's up counting. So Brother Clonson probably need to start picking up pretty close to here Wednesday night. But it says, the woman fled into the wilderness where she had prepared a place prepared of God, and they should feed her there 1,260 days. Where have we seen that 203 before? Previous chapter, back at the destruction of Jerusalem. If you go back into the book of Matthew, and this is where some of the religious groups really miss the point on this, but if you will go back into Matthew chapter 24 and look at verse 16, starting with verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and prior to that, when Rome starts surrounding the city of Jerusalem, getting ready for the siege, verse 16 says, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of the house, neither let him which is in the field return. Some religious groups want this to have to do with the period of rapture where some go and some stay. But if you tie that together and look at it here, in Matthew, Christ was warning them that destruction was going to take place, giving them the information of when, and was telling them to get out and hide until it was over. Well, if the siege was 42 months, which it was, and here the woman hid for 42 months, now the siege is over. Does that make sense? Brother Clarence? Correct. Correct. As Brother Clarence just this pointed out, which is a very, very important part. Over 1 million people died in the siege of Jerusalem, in the destruction of Jerusalem. But Josephus pointed out that not one Christian died in that siege. Very, very important point there. Thank you, brother. Thank y'all so much for your attention and your comments.